Alright, welcome back. Let's move on with the final three legal strategies, and we move to the decision rights. And the decision rights we know already because next to the appointment and dismissal right, it was presented already as the other two key rights of shareholders as exercised in the workshop lecture. So we identified a top three as one of those quick and dirty rules and grocery lists of what to remember of this course. One, so in terms of shareholder rights, one, the appointment and dismissal of the board, two, the decisions on the financial statements, and three, the decision on the dividend and other major decisions. All right, that list. Having said that, obviously, when you look at 15 or 12 or 10 jurisdictions, the main jurisdictions, there are some variations with a surprising deviation in the United States of America, or most states, predominantly Delaware, where this right pertaining to financial statements and Delaware is restricted. So on the continent, we quite often have a idea that the United States is the shareholder's paradise. But the funny thing is, moving to this topic, that it's a sort of outlier where that right on the financial statements and dividends is predominantly given to the board. So there, beware of normality. The idea is that in the perfect capitalist world with low transaction costs, the party that is best equipped to decide on investments and paying out dividends is the board, because they know a lot about research and development and all kinds of other considerations to make the machine profitable, which in the end is in the interest of the shareholder. So just to, after drilling you on the grocery list, taking the next step by sensitizing you for outliers or deviations in the real jurisdiction. And on the other side, Europe interpreting this in a broad sense, that those rights are very important for the shareholders. A middle road approach is not to focus on a meeting on the financial statements, but to focus on the appointment of the auditor. Because, as you're well aware, those auditing rules are quite elaborate. So the international ones are, I believe, in a regular manual, 1,300 pages, guidelines on how to make financial statements. And the idea in this middle road is, okay, let's then agree on a auditor, so Deloitte, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, those types of firms, and that represents the sort of deciding power, because then they do their job in the way they are supposed to do it, and the idea is that transaction costs are then low and that the interests are all aligned and that the best possible financial statements is the end result. And why on earth would a individual shareholder living on the beach of Bahamas have any say in such a complicated matter? And so that's sort of middle core. And sometimes there's even a specific committee, a sub-organ in the board realm, tasked with selecting and appointing auditors. And this is just a little part of a much bigger story about auditors. Also from a societal perspective, what is their task? this Chinese walls issue within those firms, the advisory department and the auditing department, and are they talking to each other or not, and all kinds of other topics you got introduced to, I guess, in field trips and all kinds of other courses. And this is then the corporate law item only. Well, let's move to a abstract way of dealing with those decision rights and look at the ex ante, ex post division. And ex ante is then the field where the principal has the initiative, and the ex post version is where the principal, the shareholder, has a sort of final say, also known as a veto. How does this work in practice? So, if you have the right of initiative, and let's take the example of appointing a board member, then in drafting the agenda of a shareholder meeting, you can mail to the secretary of the company, please put on the agenda this and this name as an option to be appointed. So you take initiative. And here we start talking about, in your eyes, the most boring thing on the globe, being the agenda of a meeting. You've been in meetings, and you always wondered, what on earth is this agenda piece of paper doing in our conversation? I mean, we are about to organize an event. Let's talk about the event, not about the agenda. Here we see all of a sudden, conceptually, that the agenda is a sort of the carrier of the right of initiative, the ex ante tool of a principle to align interests. How does this translate to legislation? That, for instance, the Corporate Code of Delaware says shareholders or a coalition of shareholders at a minimum of 10% or something like that are allowed to take the initiative to put a name on the agenda, and then if something is on the agenda, legally speaking, members of the meeting should have their say on it and say yes or no. That's the idea of the agenda. And then you force the meeting to make up their mind and potentially vote for your candidate. Initiative. Veto is the other way around. Other jurisdictions that says, we don't like those activistic shareholders. The board or the supervisory board is the best equipped organ to choose their successors. So they do the recruiting, you know, recruitment firms, you've been there. And they try to vision what type of new leader. It's quite often about the presidents, about the leaders, who should be appointed. And they are allowed to put those candidate names on the agenda, and then exposed, from the perspective of the meeting, the shareholders, principals can then say no. So here we are entering a bizarre square millimeter area of the question, who puts the name on the agenda? The agent or the principal? Leading to a framing as principal initiative or principal veto type of And here again, in this so-called shareholder-friendly United States of America, most in particularly the state of Delaware, they opt for that principal veto arrangement. again, with the same reasoning, let's not have doing shareholders on the beach of Bahamas doing job interviews, you know? What do they know? They didn't earn their own money in the first place. They happen to be millionaire, you know? So that's sort of metaphor I use to understand why we should not listen to shareholders. On the other side, the natural story is that the shareholder was the family owner of the business and was doing the business, you know, Albert Heijn, actually selling stuff in his grocery shop in Zaandam. And so there's a union between shareholder and manager and executive, you know, and the person who creates the value. Or think of all those artistic entrepreneurs on the globe. You know, the Beatles, Madonna, your generation examples. They are the artists that produce the money and a board member of their own firm and their own shareholder. So sure, they have all the say because it's their thing. And so that makes this whole theory sometimes complicated, because sometimes we look at it as a mama-daddy firm with just one person, or all of a sudden we talk about the mainstream multinational enterprises of this course, this dispersed shareholdership multinational enterprise. Okay, that is on decision rights. Also to mention changes in the Articles of Incorporation and other major decisions. Not to forget to mention mergers and acquisitions, the topic of last week. Let's move to the agency constraints. This is the most natural field or subtopic of jurists, because jurists tend to think in rules that forbid and allow stuff, and the consequence is then liability. Let's look at the tools once more, because I mentioned legislation, I mentioned case law, I mentioned governance codes or soft law, and here I add to that list the Articles of Incorporation themselves, of the corporations themselves, because that is sort of private legislation for the company. And in that private legislation, and I already showed you once an example in week 2, you can articulate specific sort of arrangements, or you can repeat the idea of the law so that participants, board members, can see it in their own sort of Articles of Incorporation. And constraints, as in things you're not allowed to do. And then we have the two flavors again, ex ante, ex post. Think of ex ante constraints that certain types of legal persons need a minimum capital, or that quite a lot of jurisdictions have in their legislation an ID when dividends are not allowed to be paid out. When creditors will then be suffering. And those are constraints in legislation or repeated in Articles of Incorporation that has as legal consequence that if you do the forbidden act, there is no legal consequence. So it is null and void. So if you establish a corporation without the minimum capital, then there is no corporation. And that's the magic of law. So in ex ante, when nothing happened, and you do the wrong instrument, the wrong civil notary, or the wrong process, then you do not get what you want. That is the best thing. But The moment the ball starts rolling, the company starts doing things, society is not helped with statements like, well, then it's null and void. Because, well, what are we then doing with the damage, you know? So then we have a different tool, and the tool you already know, because it was upgraded to a core characteristic, and the tool is liability. So the exposed language is, if you do things that are not supposed to happen, then, magic, 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 you are liable. What was the starting point? You are not liable. What is the punishment? You are liable. With words or synonyms like personal liable. So your private home and your private car as agent is at stake. That is what liability is.